All About Writing with Ben and Sara.
Welcome to All About Writing, the podcast that covers everything about the world of writing from the inside out. This is episode 72, part 13 on our series on writing craft. I'm Ben, here with my co-host Sara, who is an award-winning, best-selling author, screenwriter, editor, and TED Talk presenter.
And I'm Sara here with my co-host Ben, who is an award-winning best-selling author and ghostwriter, editor, and publisher. And today we have a guest that I'm very excited about. I want everybody to welcome Dr. Rebecca N Thompson. And we are going to have a bit of a deep dive into the world of memoir writing. But before we do that, Rebecca, could you kind of give everybody a little bit of your bio? What's your background and a little bit about yourself and how you even got into memoir writing?
Sure. And thanks for having me, Ben and Sara. This is great. I've been looking forward to this. So thank you for the opportunity. My name is Rebecca N Thompson. Becca is fine in conversation. And I'm a family medicine and public health physician from Portland, Oregon. My main areas of interest and practice professionally have been women's and children's health. And I'm the author of a recent collaborative memoir about complicated paths to family and the effects of health and illness across generations. So just, backing up, I got into this through my medical practice, wanting to share the stories of patients I was caring for, colleagues who had really interesting backgrounds and stories that contributed to how they practiced medicine, how they cared for their patients, and then the ways that I saw some of the stories of my friends that I'd known for decades with a new lens after going through medical complications and becoming a patient myself.
So you are highly qualified specifically in your field, which bled into the memoir writing. So I mean, that basically answers, how you ended up writing a memoir, but what was the moment where you were like, I want to actually write a book? Because it's one thing to maybe, document it or even blog about it, but a book is a whole different undertaking.
Yeah. So, and I'll share the title too, because it actually informs that question. So the title is Held Together, a shared memoir of motherhood, medicine, and imperfect love. And the way that I realized I wanted to do this was, I would say, both in the sharing and the imperfection. So I wanted to be able to make something bigger out of complications that I'd been through, that I saw my patients going through, and not just have these sort of isolated struggles, but create something that could be both comfort and advocacy for understanding people's stories. So now getting kind of down into the weeds a little bit with that, because I know that's where y'all would like to go. Me too. Basically, when I was finishing up some of the earliest parts of my training, more of the public health side of things, was when my husband and I first decided this is maybe a good time to have a baby, like kind of early faculty, end of residency, that kind of window. And very quickly, we went through a string of 3 incredibly complicated pregnancies, 2 of which were life-threatening to me. And those 3, they were all losses, like none of them resulted in a living child. And as I'm doing that, I'm trying to figure out, who am I as a young physician? What do I want to bring to my career? And it really changed how I practiced medicine. I found myself, initially it was very isolating and very confusing, even though I had all this professional experience. To be a patient is a whole different thing, right? And once I did start to open up about my story, after initially feeling, now here's the held together part, I was maybe holding on to it too tightly. I was holding it back. Once I offered it to people, I felt like all of our stories started to come together into this bigger whole that made sense of, that created meaning from what we'd experienced. And I wanted a way to preserve this, to capture these women's voices in the most compelling way possible, and offer it back to other women and families and healthcare professionals so that they could learn from our stories, both to find that comfort for themselves and to be advocates for their patients and the women in the communities all around them.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And
It's been so rewarding. It's been so incredible for me too. So
and
humbling, and yeah.
and it must have been quite a challenge too, not only dealing with your own experience, but now people's other experiences. Is
Yes.
to, as you put this book together, how do you decide what to include? Because
Mm.
so much
Mhm.
to say, but you have to make it a book.
Yeah, and I've said many times that I could walk up. So there are 21 other women and myself in this book. All of us identify as women. All of us identify as mothers. Now we broadly define those things. There's some maybe unconventional definitions of those things in here, but we all define ourselves that way. I say I could walk up to 21 other women on the street and do this project with them. 21 other people on the street. We could do a project like this. Everyone has a story. But how I decided how I found these people, it was completely organic. I didn't say, okay, well, I want to make sure my book includes and list, fertility issues, pregnancy complications, surrogacy, adoption, foster parent, step parenthood. I didn't do that, but all those things are in there. These are just the people that I'm so fortunate to know. And so about half of us are medical professionals. Many of them were people that I worked with in different capacities in my own training and professional life. Many of them, including some of the healthcare professionals, were my patients. I found that it was really rewarding, and I'm really honored that many, many other healthcare professionals started coming to me for care, as their physician, especially as I not just revealed my story. People don't always need to have heard it to understand that you get it, that you're listening to them on this different level just because of what you've been through, even if they don't know why or the deals they feel it. And I just started thinking about, I want to write. Well, that's kind of a whole separate line of conversation too. Like, why did I even want to write a book? And we can come to that. But like when I did realize I want to write a book, I wanted to write a book. I knew that I just wanted to include ordinary people, but I wanted to capture these extraordinary moments in their lives. So I invited the women that I just happened to know, and all of them had these incredible stories. I thought I knew them. Some of the women, I knew them, some better than others. Some I'd known for decades as friends. Some I'd worked with for 10 years or more. Some were like pretty new patients to my practice. But for every one of them, even the longtime friends, I was surprised by things that I learned and the threads that we pulled out and the commonalities, the universal themes. I was always surprised.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of want to dovetail further into that a little bit, because what you're talking about, it is unusual, and we should just tell our listeners too, it is unusual for there to be a memoir of shared experiences. That is not a normal structure for the memoir genre.
No, I couldn't find any. That's why I wrote it. I want this to exist.
It's kind of like an anthology, but memoir in some ways.
Yes, and I want to distinguish that with you. Let's talk more about that too afterward.
Yeah. Yes. So it is still memoir, but I'm interested, like, because it was a memoir, but also unique, and you're dealing with different voices.
Right.
What were some of the challenges in pulling it together then? Because there had to have been, were they all writers? Did you have to get an editor? How did you?
No.
What were those challenges?
You'll have it. Yeah. So to distinguish it from an anthology, the way that I understand an anthology is, people are asked to contribute their story. They write their story down. It's probably going to be edited, probably relatively lightly, but it's edited to some degree, plus or minus how much they already have experience writing. And then the stories are kind of just put together because they make sense as a whole, like just one after the other in this
thematically usually.
Yeah, exactly. Themed anthology. I love those, but that's not at all what this is. What I really wanted was in the collaboration. When I say shared memoir, it's shared in the process. Also, like, we're sharing it with the readers. It's all these levels of shared, but the process, now every process for each of the 21 of them was like a little bit different, but very much some recurring themes. The biggest one is that all of them included a lot of oral history, a lot of recorded interview. And some of them, I'd say a lot of them, the majority of them, were only by recorded interview, pretty much exclusively. So what that looked like, and I come back to some of the women did do some of the writing, and I'd like to give them some of the attention for that as well. But to talk about the oral history part, because that's really the core of how we did this. I went into it knowing that I wanted to help kind of shepherd these voices and help craft the story and really work in tandem, in partnership with each of these women individually to create the kind of most elevated, most cohesive version of her story that we could tell. So I've tried to write them, taking each, when we would meet for, say, probably usually 2-3 hours at a time, many times over several years. The whole project took just over 10 years.
Wow.
Each of the chapters, I started in July of 2014 was the first one I started working on. Each of the chapters, each of the women's stories, she and I would work on it over, several years, because I'd be working on multiple of them at once, and they would each come together on their own time. We would meet up, whether in person if she's local or on the phone if she's not. Lots of people are from all over the country and a few from outside of the US as well. So we'd meet, on the phone or in a coffee shop or for a walk if she's local. And we would just sit and talk about her story and record it. And then I would take that recording and not necessarily transcribe it exactly, but like listen to it, pull out the themes, make notes, start writing paragraphs, and try to write her story using her voice, using her words. Now, I was, there's no better word for it, so I'll say I was writing them, but I was using her story. I was using everything I could capture about who she was and how she wanted to tell it and how she wanted to present herself. All of the stories are completely true. I say they're not always going to be 100% accurate because we changed about half of them, used a pseudonym, or some geographical details changed and personal details changed for privacy for themselves or their children or their significant others. And we didn't, we're not going to fact check what color you said the carpet was in the room that you remember. It's really like, what is the core of your memory? And so that was the foundation of how these were all written. Now, some of the women are amazing writers. They have one of them has published a book herself. That's Nancy, about taking her children out into the wilderness, especially in backcountry Alaska, where she lives. And she did a lot to really help craft her story and give me pieces of her writing. She has a beautiful blog online that people can go and read her essays as well. There were a handful of women who've done a lot of journaling, and they were gracious enough to share some of those journals with me, or they'd sent really elaborate emails to friends and family during a time of crisis to update them about a medical situation or something like that. And many people shared things like that with me. Then the other kind of iterative part of the process is after the interviews, after I had combined, journal entries, interviews, whatever, on say a first pass, a third pass, a fifth pass, we went through so many times, I would send this back to the woman on a shared document and say, okay, what did I get wrong? What should we expand on? I highlighted this paragraph. Could you flesh that out a little bit more? Tell me how you felt during that. Could you write me a short paragraph about that hospital stay? And then I would take that and again, try to bring it into the same tone and voice to capture her words, but in the most elevated possible way.
There's a lot of editing, a lot of work.
So it's not, I wouldn't even call it editing. I mean, I really felt like I was trying to channel or shepherd her story, because it's even, I think one thing that gets at this too is many, many people have told me that it reads like fiction. And that's what I was going for. And so it wasn't like someone gave me, started from a point in her story and told it in some certain way, either jumping in medias res or linearly, and then told it. And then I wrote that down and edited it and tweaked it. It was very much like we just talked, and her story might have started anywhere, kind of from whatever we call the beginning of this particular thing we're highlighting. Because, memoir is just a moment or a glimpse of a certain portion of your life. It's not an autobiography. So she's telling me this moment that's going to become a mini memoir for her, essentially. I still, as far as I remember, pretty much, most of the cases, as far as I remember, I'm still making the decisions about, okay, we are going to drop into the story here. This is where I'm going to start telling it. These are the decisions I'm making. This is why I'm trying to sort of guide how we tell the story, right? We're going to drop in here, pulling in the reader with something in the middle of some dilemma, or we don't know what's happening, but we're suddenly in the scene. And then we have a narrative arc, we have character development, we have, the scene and the visuals of the area to really paint this picture. I really wanted it to feel like fiction, but be true.
And that's a really important part about memoir writing is
Hmm.
it's not just a dry recounting of
Right.
events one after the other.
Right.
You may not be entirely accurate, but you are true. And I
And
think
you're
what you said
trying to
is
be.
really, yeah, of
Yes.
course you are. Yeah, yeah. You're not
Yes,
making stuff up,
exactly.
but you may
Exactly.
leave details out because they're not important, not like
Right.
to what you're trying to say. And
Right.
the key
Right.
here is truth.
Right.
Yeah.
They're all true.
Yeah.
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 That must have been a fascinating journey and a time
It's
exhausting.
so rewarding. It's so, yeah, it's not easy. And a lot of it, I really, I know, Sarah, you have 3 kids. I know that I have 2, and a lot of, and Ben, do you have children as
I
well?
have 2 kids.
Okay, so you know it as well. So fitting it into the in-between moments. So much of this book was written in the car pickup line, or as I waited outside a drop-off birthday party, or whatever it might be. I always had my laptop with me, or I was jotting down notes on my phone, or I love to swim, so I'd have a little Write in the Rain notebook next to the pool, and I would like jot down thoughts when I would come back from a lap. Um, so it's all written in the in-between moments. That's where I would think of these connections and notice the threads. And of course, there was hours and hours of time sitting at the computer pulling it all together. But a lot of that was in like 20-minute increments too.
Wow.
10 years. That's why I took 10 years.
Well, and I guess that I was going to kind of ask, like, advice. Let's say somebody is
Yeah.
writing a memoir, any
Yeah.
memoir, or even something similar to this, or though I
Yeah.
think you have a unique situation that's not the norm by far. But what advice would you give people who are really truly interested in deep diving into memoir writing? Like
Yeah.
any kind of
Yeah, that is the advice. I mean,
like
it's
write
different
it
for
in the pool.
everybody. In the margins, literally and figuratively in the margins. It is my advice, but I will say, not everything's going to work for everybody. So whatever works for you, like try all the different things. But one of the things I really recommend you try is just don't put too much pressure on yourself to think you need to carve out an hour or 3 hours or a writing retreat weekend or anything like that. Um, Sometime, that's great. If you have that time and you can make it, and by all means, I made blocks of those time as much as I could. Those are precious, but don't discount what you can get done in little increments over a long period of time. They add up because, there's also something too when you've left the piece right in the middle of it and you're really like, oh, I wish I could do more, but you have to put it down. There's that eagerness to come back to it. And there's also, if it's every day or two for a few minutes, you're still remembering it. You're still in the flow almost. You don't have to get back into it as much. And it makes me think of when my kids were little. They're teenagers now, but when they were little, I had this philosophy of the play date, because play dates can end in meltdowns, right? So I always felt like, oh, you want to end the play date while they're still having fun, end the play date before they're tired of each other and fighting over the last toy, right? So it's like that. You end the writing session when you still really want to come back to it, and maybe you'll come back a little more eager next time.
That's great advice. I love it.
It's good advice. That really is.
So I have a question about, again, the whole process of memoir writing. Now,
Yeah.
when you set out to do this and you realize, okay, I want to tell this story and these
Yeah.
stories,
Yeah.
did you start knowing this is the point that I want to make, or did that emerge as you were going? And you didn't really know what you just want to say something. And then
Yeah,
you
both.
yeah?
Both. I knew my first thought about, and this will come back to like why write a book. This was your question way at the beginning.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
kind of
Please
at the
feel
most,
free to speak to that too. Yeah.
yeah, at the most basic level, I was a couple years into kind of that attending, like the level outside of training where you're starting to be more on your own, right? Attending level position. And I was like, I really want to do something I want to do some kind of writing project. I've always loved to write. And I wanted to do something that would help families. I'm family medicine, as I'd said, all this interest in kind of prenatal care, women's health, reproductive rights, and what could I do to make other people help other people feel supported during that. So I started thinking about maybe it's like an infant feeding guide, because I was also a lactation consultant, to counter that feeling of you have to breastfeed. Like, no, we want to figure out what's best for your family and meet you there. And how do we balance, how do we get the baby fed? So I wanted to help people with that. But I was drawn always to the anecdotes. I just wanted to write all the anecdotes about these families. I'm like, okay, I think I need to write a book about the stories. And then I thought, well, I really don't want the stories to be only about the early days of parenthood or fertility, or like a book of birth stories, an anthology of birth stories. We have those. They're interesting. I've read them. But I wanted this to be about really generations and the impact of health experiences integrated into lives, not just these early moments in familyhood, right? And how we build our families, how we create and choose and, chosen family beyond the typical definitions. So that's how I kind of came into, well, this should be people's stories. And then I realized about how it could be woven together. So the other unusual format part, I feel like I'm not quite answering your question, Ben, but I'll get there. But the other really unusual formatting thing about Held Together is that not only is it not an anthology of like one story after another, but my story is broken up into pieces. It's if you can read my story as a standalone and skip the other chapters, but my story starts out telling part of what's happening to me, and then it pauses, and because there's a moment where my life intersects with someone else's. And the first one is Tess. So you see me having a phone call with Tess, and then my story stops. And then you read Tess's story. So and you see the phone call in her story as well later.
Yeah.
Each of the stories of the other women is self-contained. My story is told in pieces as it weaves into the other women's stories.
Very clever.
That's really cool.
And I wish people will write more books like this. It was so, I want to read more. So please, others, do this, but I haven't found any others like this. So, going back, Ben, did that answer any of what you wanted me to get at, or what? Tell me more.
What you said was fascinating. That's an amazing technique. Is to, if you're going to have multiple stories, have one of them be the central thread throughout, and the others.
Right.
That's
But
brilliant.
memoir in general, yeah.
I guess when people tend to write memoirs, they tend to come into it with a purpose. Like this is what I want to say about me.
Yeah.
What I want to say about my life. They're obviously not going to include everything about their life because they only want to include the relevant things.
Right.
So I guess you sort of answered in that you wanted to cover these topics.
Yeah, that's true. But I think more to maybe your second point about, did that change as I went along? I think that's what I probably haven't really addressed. So I did have that purpose at the beginning of wanting to write something that would help other people feel less alone in challenges in family life, both early days and beyond, and to make meaning for just the 22 of us, right? Like, I knew these amazing people and I wanted to make something bigger out of that collective as a project for all of us on our behalves. It was both, to help us all heal ourselves as we heal each other, as I would say. But then as I went through, I think actually talking about that structure and how my story is broken up through and like weaves in, that does kind of address how the purpose changed. Because when I first started, I didn't magically have this idea of how they would all weave together. That kind of emerged. I initially thought, well, this is really different from an anthology because I'm collaborating with each woman and I'm committed to helping her. They're not all writers, but they're all storytellers. Everyone is. And so how do I amplify and elevate her voice, right? But as I went through it, I realized, well, it's not just that I'm going to tell my story and then theirs. In fact, this is kind of interesting and craft-wise. I could not decide if my chapter, when I first thought of it just as my chapter standalone, should be first because I'm kind of introducing the whole idea of the project, or if my story should be last because you kind of read through all these and then you meet me and sort of like how my story kind of touches on the others a bit. And I could talk about that a little in my chapter, but it's like, I never could decide, is it first or last? And then it was really more of an epiphany of like, oh no, mine can be told in sections. And then it will really show how the threads come together and weave together. And so that purpose really did evolve. I think the purpose of helping others see stories of families of such a diverse range of who they are and how they came together, that was the purpose initially, to help people feel like there's no one way to be a family. And then the evolution of that was, oh, you can really see that everyone's story has things in common. And the more we compare, we shouldn't just compare like on social media to feel inadequate. We should compare to see what we have, these amazing similarities. You read something about a woman, a family, you're like, oh yeah, that's never going to happen to me. Because all these stories are pretty like unusual things that happen to people, right? Some pretty difficult for sure, but all unusual. And the feeling as a reader is like, yeah, that's never going to happen to me. But very quickly, I think you'll find, oh, well, but I understand exactly how she felt. And that makes me think of it just like when this other thing happened to me. The themes are universal. The details are so specific and those vary family to family, but we all go through the same kinds of things.
Sarah?
I was going to say, I mean, that's the beauty of Memoir, right? Is where our stories, we try and push them out to the wider world so that hopefully we can either inspire or help or touch other people.
Right.
I do want to kind of ask though, because, you know, veering away from the emotion part of this, how, in your opinion, how much like factual research needs to go into memoir writing? Because I know we can all feel our feelings almost, you know, like therapy on the page, but you know, is there any fact finding? Is there statistics? And if so, what does it look like? And I think other people don't realize like memoir writing is not necessarily just talking about yourself or journaling and then publishing it, right?
Oh, not at all.
Dates? Are you checking like what kind of fact checking or research goes into the memoir process?
I love that you're asking. This is a great question because oh my gosh, so many things. I have so many thoughts on this. So the detail, like I said, about the carpet, we're never going to fact check that. But I cannot tell you how many timelines I wrote out and drew out for myself and for other people. Like, okay, wait, if we're saying this happened at this time and this was also happening and this overlaps then, and you know, how old was the child then? Is that consistent? I have to do the math to say, well, now when we talk about this other event, are we being accurate in this case? Accurate, not just truth, but accuracy of what time has passed and like the consistency in different stories for timelines. I wrote out and did math on a ton of timelines like that. But in the bigger picture, and this is what I think is even more fascinating and where memoir can be so universal or relevant, there's a lot of historical detail in Held Together. So I will say there's like very little, there's none actually. I think I pulled everything I could find and think of pop culture, that kind of in the moment, things that date a story in a negative way. There's like nothing like that. There's no name of a product or a movie or a book or a well-known person, celebrity, whatever. Nothing. There's historical information. So maybe there's a little bit of a blurry section in between those ideas, but I tried to be so for example, there's information, there's ways that people's lives are influenced by the changes in adoption law, closed versus open adoption, abortion law, 9/11, what it was like to be Iranian American in 9/11 and how some of that played out and how people treated you. There's one chapter is about the story of a Japanese American family. And Eriko talks about her, you know, generations back, her family's experience being in internment camps. And so we went back and looked so I actually dug up historical data, photographs, you know, information about the era, not just that moment in time and learning more of that history and listening to podcasts and reading books about that era in history for research for myself to help her write that, because I brought in those details. Like, she didn't remember all those details. I was looking them up, make sure we got them right. And I even went to find, like I was seeing old photographs of a certain camp and was describing like what kinds, how many barracks, how many towers, what did they look like? Like, those are historical details. Those are literal details that I found in photographs. So there was quite a bit of research to try to make sure that these historical events were portrayed accurately and consistently. They aren't just made up details.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
memoir is like so much more powerful and interesting when we can see how an individual story is being lived in the moment of these huge turning points. Oh, another one, we have a story about hemophilia. And so it talks about blood transfusions and the changes to the safety in that, in a medical sense, and how that affected her family over time and how it affected her parents' generation and then her generation and now her children's generation, her son's generation, and how that has changed how they've all experienced hemophilia in their lives.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's Erin's chapter. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's a really good distinction. Sort of big cultural movements that are
Yes.
relevant to your story as opposed to a
Yes.
specific cultural reference, which isn't.
Yeah, so it can feel historical and accurate, but also really be evergreen.
Mm-hmm.
It's reflecting on the impact of big moments, big cultural shifts and moments on an individual's life, but it's never going to feel like someone reads it and it's like, I don't even know who that is. What are you referencing about this song? Or that, like, there's none of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like a moment in history.
Really smart.
Yeah. Fabulous. Wow. Well, I am thoroughly impressed at what you put together here. This is really amazing. I mean, it sounds like
Thank
an
you.
beautiful book.
Thank you.
And what an accomplishment to bring together
Thank
22
you.
stories into one.
Yeah.
So I think we'll wrap it there today. So thanks, Becca, for joining us. If people want to learn more about you, where can they find you?
Yes, well, thank you for that. I'm happy to share my platforms. You know, I will say whatever platform I may have because of my profession or personal experience or whatever efforts to get out the word about it together, I just want to use them to lift up others. So in that sense, if you go to my website, there's a way that you can get the book through an affiliate link that sends a portion of the proceeds to Postpartum Support International, which is an organization that supports women's and children's maternal health, women's and families' maternal health. And so you can buy a copy that sends a portion of the proceeds to them. That'd be great. My website is RebeccaNThompson.com. Use the middle initial because there are lots of Rebecca Thompson, so the N is important.
Right.
And then I'm on a bunch of socials. You can find the links to that on my website too, but really everything's on the website that you might see, and all the podcasts and all the fun conversations that we've had.
Yeah. And we'll put all of Rebecca's details in the show notes, everyone. So if you want to check it there,
Thank
can find
you.
it. And to our listeners, please don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any of our chats, and feel free to leave a review. It really does help us a lot. If you want to catch up with Sara, you can do so at saradahman.com and on Instagram.
And you can find Ben at BennettRColes.com, as well as Facebook and Instagram. And just another thank you, Becca, for joining us and talking about this today. It's so fascinating. I really hope people do a deep dive into what you've done with all of these women and this really interesting, unique way of doing memoir. I'm thrilled we got you. You're the one.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So thanks for joining us. And for our listeners, please let us know if there's any other topics like this or anything else that you want us to cover. Otherwise, we'll see you again when we next chat all about writing.
This has been All About Writing with Ben and Sara.